thank you all for patience and perseverance to the bitter end of what's been a very stimulating conversation thus far. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of it. Given the topic of sustainability today, and having heard Adrian's really comprehensive presentation, some of what Adrian talked about, you could say ditto for the Henry Ford. And yet the key difference is that the National Museums of Northern Ireland have a sustainability manager who obviously knows the score. The Henry Ford has a group of staff who volunteer to do this in addition to everything else they're doing, and do it in a way that I would say accomplishes some things pretty well, but other things yet to be done. So I'm going to do a really quick overview. The green team is what we call ourselves, which isn't very original, but we started in 2019. And it was the vision of one of our vice presidents. So the vice president really for the financial areas. And he was absolutely committed to what became DEAI work, diversity, equity, access, inclusion work. And green as environmental sustainability got incorporated into that effort. So in 2019, we forged ahead as a unit. When COVID occurred, we green team remained. The DEAI work became an autonomous unit with a specific hire to accomplish it across the institution. But the DEAI, the green team continued to be a volunteer as we could get organized through. There's an administrative committee, which includes me, and I'm the historical resources curator angle of it. Then there is a facilities director. And I always have said that this effort is facilities heavy. And Adrian can yay or nay to that, but it is driven by things like recognizing greenhouse gas emissions, benchmarking those emissions, and trying to pursue reduction of waste, water use, and other, greenhouse gas emission efforts. We also have a person who has shifted duties numerous times, who's on this administration committee. And the key with this administration committee is to have people designated as responsible for certain areas. So we have need on the committee for people who are responsible for marketing and guest engagement. And that's what we no longer have. And then there's me. Oh, wait, food service. The other aspect of the Henry Ford's operations that's huge is food service. We have, having not gone into a litany about who we are this huge complex. We welcome about 1.7 million guests, more than that last year. We have 5 restaurants, full service restaurants, 2 of which operate year round. So there's a lot of attention paid to food service and a lot of, you could say, waste and greenhouse gas emissions generated because of that food service. So the food service individual is on the bigger group, but not on the administrative committee. But he and the facilities manager work very closely together because bureaucratically they're under the same vice president. So institutional structure matters when we try to put these teams together. Yeah, then there is another vice president who's very ambitious. He is the vice president for institutional advancement. And through him has launched, I would say, the advocacy stance for this. So he's really spearheaded an edible education initiative, which is the initiative that does shine light on things like regenerative agriculture, waste reduction, and farm to fork or local sourcing for the restaurant. So where does that leave my division, which is historical resources? And I would say that I I'm in this cleanup, well, I'm not a power hitter, but I'm in the cleanup position. So that's an uncomfortable place to be. It would be like the fourth batter who's supposed to hit the home run when I'll usually get an in-ground single if I'm lucky. So what do you, yeah, so what do you do in that position? So I find that I'm a cheerleader and a communicator and an effort to facilitate. And usually that involves cross-divisional projects that I would say are, well, I may think they're low impact, but they're not supposed to be. So blogs, working with the facilities division to do blogs about waste reduction, about eliminating single-use plastics, about water retention systems that are as old as the museum, irrigation, and the history of composting. Because for decades, we've been trying to compost the horse manure generated by 18 draft horses that we have as part of our stable, never to have yet accomplished that. Why? Well, now it's because composting rules have changed, and a lot of composters, in fact, you could say all composters, say no to horse manure because horse digestive systems are different. And if you cannot guarantee that the feed that the horses consume are free from residual pesticides and herbicides, no composter will take it because those residuals will end up in whatever compost is generated, and not therefore a fertile plant bed. So what's the solution? We need to do it ourselves, and we've been arguing for that. And it's been 5 years now. This has been going on. So this is the kind of, cross-divisional engagement that you just have to commit to, or where will historical resources be in this effort? So historical resources, I asked that, it's kind of a rhetorical question. Historical resources is the entity that ensures that we're going to cultivate environmental responsibility, and that's one of our mission goals. Another one of our mission goals is engagement, professionally and publicly. So those are the two hooks that I hang what I try to do on. In terms of cultivating environmental sustainability, for the historical resources area, that means culture change. And that's not easy. And if we're thinking 5 years is a long time to still be trying to get, well, probably more like 45 years is still a long time to try to get composted horse manure. I don't know how long it's going to take to get culture change, but that's the goal. And we have a long history to hook that one, because Adrian mentioned the Anthropocene, and probably we can all define the Anthropocene. Yes. I met the Edison Institute doing business as the Henry Ford. And if there's a person on the planet that had, you could say, more than the average bear responsibility for the Anthropocene, it's Henry Ford, with the fossil fuel burning engines specifically, but also through his alliance with Thomas Edison and the whole cement industry. Those are just two examples of his Henry Ford's huge impact in greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. So to me, that's the institution's responsibility to continue to try to model best practice, but then push that out to the public. So what are some of the ways that we do that? So bear with me now, we'll see if we can move forward. I used something that was visible or identifiable just outside, the room. The many people inhabited the space in this near Reading site. And I asked the question of this space with which most of us are familiar, this notion of the more things change, do they remain the same? Are there trends that are similar? Or are we really talking about change? And who has the responsibility for what happens over time in a space? So pardon me for being an ignorant American and not versed in pronunciation. Is this Silster? So you really do say Chester. That's where I was always Chester. So yes, that's where this is. And in my little foray into the museum at Reading, it was the Atterbate site, tribe of Gauls. By the first century. So you could say those are immigrants or colonizers. Then comes the
conquerors, invaders.
Okay.
Let's get it right.
In the blank. And then the town of the administrative center for the Romans who conquered or invaded the area. And they leave their lasting footprint, which you can see in the landscape. This is even not the best one. They have a really nice one at the museum, the Reading Museum, where you can see probably still the stone roads and the ways the summer just kills the grass, specifically in those stone wall or stone road areas. But that's abandoned by 5050 or thereabouts AD. Then there's another small village there by 1086 or so. There's a medieval castle, there's a 12th century church, there's all these layers of coming and going on these places. And then it's deserted, potentially because of the Black Death. So folks, researchers, I wouldn't say speculate, but you know what I mean. Evidence allows that interpretation. And the University of Reading's Town Life Project is to document these changes over time. So there's the question. Is this the same as an environmental history of a place? And how do we as rural museum folk comprehend the scope of this project and relate it or compare it to what we might need to do to help guests understand who we are and what we need to do? Did I skip a slide? No. Okay. So let's go to the Henry Ford for one brief moment. This is Firestone Farm. So I mentioned Henry Ford and I mentioned Thomas Edison. I did not mention Harvey Firestone. Oh, I don't know what but Harvey Firestone's birthplace. Harvey Firestone also indelibly aligned and allied with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And of course, Harvey Firestone puts the world on rubber tires. So yet another one of these greenhouse gas emitters. But here's this bucolic setting, this relocated farmhouse from Columbiana County, Ohio, to the Henry Ford. This living history farm opened in 1985, 40 years ago. And it was purely within the model of a living history farm, revered. It collected a black merino sheep, which are a heavily wrinkled merino sheep, sometimes later called a type A merino. We practice, well, some people misidentify it as organic agriculture, but it's not that. It was a classic manure-fueled soil of the 1880s, while we burn coal in the kitchen stove. But when we interpret this, the interpretive manuals are still stuck in 1985. So with our time, what has changed since you look at this historic site in 1985? And what's happened over those 40 years? So think about, there were no GMOs. in 1985. The science was there, but it's not commercially viable until after that. So the public then would not have come, and the curator would not have comprehended needing to discuss these heritage farming practices with genetic modification. Or you could then add to that the other types of agriculture that are also becoming more prolific since 1985. And by that, I specifically mean low-till or no-till agriculture with lots of herbicide inputs. The whole farm to fork effort likewise existed, but it didn't have the same kind of public cachet. So regenerative agriculture had a history, but it didn't have the same resonance in a visitor's psyche. So I'm stuck, I don't mean stuck, I'm not stuck with having to revise the interpretive manual for Firestone Farm. That's my job. What I'm struck by is how to do that in our current era of an 1880 living history farm that needs to be brought into an era of increased environmental conscience on the part of the guests, recognizing the decolonization goals. So did this site have anything to do with Indigenous history? And then what is all this agriculture about? And how do things like regenerative agriculture and GMO efforts relate to the hybrid, or not hybrids, well, horticultural business that produce these seeds, but that are still heritage open pollinated seed varieties? Yeah, so one of those things that I've addressed thus far is the Indigenous perspective. And the Firestones come to Columbiana County, Ohio, in the first wave of settlement after the removal of the Indigenous people from that part of Ohio. And that was an incredibly contested national effort and accomplished by the early 1800s. So we luckily now, within the Henry Ford, have a curator of civic and political engagement who is a member of the Oneida Nation. So we can discuss all of these site histories, of which there are 84 within Greenville Village, in the context of the Indigenous history in every one of those places. So in a long-term plan, we'll be able to talk about Indigenous, the consequences of colonization as our sites can tell it, from the Connecticut to California coast and from border to border, given the sites that are in Greenville Village. Firestone Farm is simply an example of that. And I believe that that is all part of my responsibilities as a curator of agriculture and the environment within the larger context of the Green Team. So then I wanted to talk a little bit more about environmental history. And the handout that you have is Interpreting the Environment. This is the book I did back in 2019 with another environmental historian. But what I've tried to lay out here are some givens, in my humble opinion, so obviously up for debate. But you have to document your landscape as a basis for provocative interpretation that links humans to landscapes, the environment, and relationships. And at the heart, then, history is not linear. Progress or change is not progress. Yeah, and you can read on. The evidence section I added because people kept asking, well, how do you do this? Well, you do an environmental history in the same way you do any history. It's the evidence is added on these living environments that have changed in their own ways over time. And I call this place exploration and truly cribbing off of space exploration to try to help you understand that it is an unknown in many ways. But there are so many things that you can read within the landscape and within your site evidence to get an environmental history of your museum. And with an environmental history of the museum or of an individual site relocated to a space, you can begin to construct how humans use natural resources in these 7 categories, which are there, the bold heads. And then you can talk about the process of natural resource extraction, but you can also get to the key point of advocacy. So how do you use these things to help the public understand that they need to be involved in some way if change is going to happen? Because your site becomes the place where you can explain if this, therefore, because of this. And just to try to illustrate this, isn't this, if only it were this simple. What comes into a space and what goes out of a space is obviously not that simple, because you've got all these circularities that occur, but I don't know, 100 years or so or when the first aerial photograph of a location in England, I think is 1882, from a balloon. But this is simply a map, and it came from a blog that the archivist here, I guess, does. And so where is it on the north side?
Just off the Acacias Road.
Okay.
That's where we are.
So that's the Colmog, the Acacias, right?
Okay.
Point six.
And I never good
And
utilize the tech.
when check it, well, yeah, I can't point with that.
There, it's up there, yeah.
I never could find it, but I wanted to see what it looked like at least 100 years ago or 120 years ago. And then what else, what other layers are here? I mean, there are numerous ones, and I'm sure that someone knows, but it's that whole idea of how many conquests have occurred and how many generations of resource utilization and allocation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how does that then become part of a gardenscape that we've been talking about, that becomes some kind of interpretive element to what is now more maybe an green therapy zone or a environmental play area, or better, an agricultural play area. That's, I mean, yeah, how do you layer it? You can't do everything at once. It's all a part of master planning. And these spaces certainly weren't being incorporated into master plans in the same way that 10-year master plans occur for general museum operation. Okay, so this is the interior of the Henry Ford not long after it opened in 1929. And Henry Ford looks like he vacuumed or hoovered, as yes, up agricultural implements across the country, but he was really very careful. And he wanted the first this and the prototype that, with an emphasis on harvesting technology, but not exclusively that. And so it's not random. But we have a ton of stuff to manage. So another hat that the curator on the Green Team wears is arguing for sustainable collecting. Yeah, this is tough. And honestly, while I try to be very selective, I have colleagues, often brand new curatorial positions in a 100-year-old institution, who are building with collections of 200, 2,000, 5,000 objects at a time. But I stick to my guns. Peter Cousins was my predecessor, who came here back in 1976 to his first IEMA meeting with his number 20 Massey Harris self-propelled combine, a historic American, American Agricultural Engineers Society landmark, which I won't go into, but I can't collect that kind of large technology. But what do I need to do to bring more students and the general public along on this ride. So there, this is not the only thing I collected last year, but this is the Agris drone. Now, I don't know how many of you have been in any way able to think about modern precision agriculture, but precision agriculture is changing the way people farm. For the very first time last year, I wrote a check to the business that was a helicopter application. And this is an octocopter, so I still need to learn more about exactly. It's a helicopter. It just happens to have 8. And a long story, because I think it warrants it. I wanted, because we're a US museum, I wanted the ag drone manufactured in the US. And there were companies in Kansas, but we partnered with the Michigan Soybean Committee. And that project results because the Michigan soybean farmers, when they sell their crop, pay a small tax, usually about 1.5%, that goes to the Michigan Soybean Committee to advocate for soybeans, for growers, for processors, for the business. So one of the ways they're advocating is to partner with the Henry Ford, because we have this long history of Ford and alternative proteins, specifically through soybeans. So they said, well, you need a drone, and you need a DJI drone. DJI is a China-based company. And I said, oh no. Well, then I did research. So we did have a drone, which was arguably the best drone for aerial photography, manufactured in 2015, first on the product, first available commercially in 2016. It won Industrial Designer of America award. And because it won that award, it's in our collection. DJI did a Ford and put that Berkeley, California-based company out of business. And then the same year, it released this drone. So the other company didn't have an agricultural spray application drone, but DJI would not tolerate that level of competition. They were going to release their own, high caliber photo drone. But this drone was purchased by a small community college, Northwestern Michigan College, and used in one of, if not the first, uncrewed aerial operator licensing programs in the country. And this would have been one of the first of the DJI drones to enter the United States. Okay, so all of those things, layer upon layer, caused me to say, yes, okay. We will accept this gift from Northwestern Michigan College. Why is this important for environment, for sustainability? Well, remarkably, it immediately went on exhibit, which never happens, largely because of the allies that we built. Namely, our Henry Ford Academy has a drone program. So they're training students in robotics, and they're training students in artificial intelligence, and drones play a huge role in that. So the Academy was interested in having access to it. It also got the support of the Institutional Advancement Division, who was very happy to see it installed. And there it is, to tell the story that's so important to the curator of agriculture and the environment. And that is about the drone as a technology that's changing the way farmers farm. Spot applications and representative of artificial intelligence in agriculture. Now, there's a lot more to that I won't go into, but this drone is low on the quotient of AI, but its successor, which was released the next year, had begun already to incorporate more imaging and what I call field recognition, even though yeah, facial recognition. So that's a whole nother paper that I'm working on in terms of AI and ag, which is agricultural intelligence. Last thing I will say, advocacy. So our same vice president for institutional advancement that I think I mentioned started this edible education effort. And that relates to food service and slow foods and including the National Farm to School lunch program that they advocate. As the chefs at one of these 5 restaurants wanted to do something relative to Rachel Carson. Why, you might ask? Well, we do not have a Rachel Carson collection, but we have the Carver Carson Donor Society, which is heavily invested in edible education and, regenerative agriculture to the tune of about $4 million at the moment. So the chefs wanted to know what Rachel Carson ate. Now I could tell her and or him, the chef is Dave, I told him what Carver ate because George Washington Carver published almost 680 recipes in 40 plus booklets over his 40 plus year career. Many of them, as he acknowledged, copied from cookbooks, but tried and tested appropriate for Alabama farmers. So they read through these recipes, they adopted some, modified them, and put them in place in the restaurants. What did Rachel Carson eat? Can anyone tell me? I've been working on this for 5 years. And I can tell you that she ate very little and she never wrote about it. And people who knew her talk about sandwiches. Yes, she also claimed to like coffee, which, good. And she drank tea. And I know where she ate and drank these things, but I do not know what they were. But I don't know how many of you have read Silent Spring as closely as I've had to read Silent Spring to try to tease out anything about what, so there's this mention of cranberries, but absolutely no evidence that she ate them. But in the frontispiece, forward, introduction, preface, not sure what, she says, this book, Silent Spring, could not have been written without the dedicated service or dedicated support of Ida Sproul. Well, who was Ida Sproul? So that's Ida Sproul. 7 years, Rachel Carson's housekeeper, and not the first of the Black housekeepers that Rachel Carson had. So suddenly it's possible to think about the real nexus of the civil rights movement and the environmental movement, even though the two of them may very well have not known what the other was doing. This gives me goosebumps as I think about this, and you may think, how does this relate to environmental sustainability or sustainability in general? But it's so key because it's uncovering these interlocked lives that no one thinks to care about. Nobody has disclosed for decades. The family may not. I mean, I know that Roger Christie, who's Rachel Carson's great nephew, remembers Ida Sproul. I don't know if Ida Sproul's deceased, her husband's deceased, her son and daughter-in-law are deceased. So I'm now on the trail of the grandchildren to see what, if anything, they knew. I know where Ida Sproul is buried. It's just part of a long process to try to put the pieces together. I don't have anything directly to do with benchmarking, but I can explain why the Henry Ford needs to commit to that without fail and with all effort, with all deliberate speed, as the Civil Rights Act said. And And yeah, I can write environmental histories of the Henry Ford, which I'm working on. Also remarkable. And I can keep trying to encourage other museums to write environmental histories because I think that they're important, but now it's my job to figure out why and articulate that so others may think it's also important. So this is hopefully a little bit of a start to that. Of course, I appreciate any and all feedback as we work through this. And yes, if anybody has any questions, once I get back to the other side of the pond, I will check my email and at that email address. Thank you.